Emmylou Harris spent her life singing about devotion, longing, and love that never quite finds its way home. Yet her own story unfolded through separation, difficult decisions, and long stretches of solitude. As the years passed and many artists turned inward toward family, Emmylou remained largely alone. No lasting marriage. No publicly defined partner. Only music endured, alongside memories that never fully settled into peace. Behind a voice often described as the heart of Americana lies a life shaped by division. Again and again, Emmylou stood between opposing forces: motherhood and artistry, stability and freedom, human intimacy and unwavering loyalty to music. Every step forward in her career demanded a sacrifice. Marriages fell apart. Children grew up at a distance. Profound bonds formed but were never given names or permanence. She stood at the center of defining moments in country and folk history, singing beside legends, creating albums that redirected entire genres. Yet when the applause faded, what remained were quiet rooms, empty evenings, and music as the only structure strong enough to hold her upright. Emmylou Harris's story is not a conventional success narrative. It is a quiet tragedy shaped by honesty and endurance. When audiences hear tenderness in her voice, they rarely hear the accumulation of unspoken farewells beneath it. Those choices did not begin with fame. They were formed much earlier, in a childhood where emotional expression was secondary to discipline, and silence was often mistaken for strength. Emmylou Harris was born in 1947 in Birmingham, Alabama, into a military family. Her father served as a Marine Corps officer in World War II and the Korean War. At one point, he was listed as missing in action and later confirmed as a prisoner of war. When he returned, he brought home wounds that were never fully articulated. In that household, some stories were not told, emotions were rarely named, and resilience was treated not as a choice but as an obligation. Military life meant frequent relocations, from Alabama to North Carolina and later to Virginia. For a child, this constant movement created an early familiarity with detachment. Friends came and went. New schools demanded quick adaptation. Emmylou learned to stand quietly within groups, to observe rather than reveal, maintaining outward control while inner unrest went largely unspoken. At Garfield High School in Woodbridge, Virginia, she excelled. She ranked near the top of her class, played saxophone in the school band, participated actively in extracurricular life, and was even elected Miss Woodbridge. On the surface, she embodied balance and achievement. But inwardly, she was not a dreamy adolescent. She learned early how to perform her assigned roles without disruption, how to avoid questions that reached too deep, how to manage herself without complaint. Music entered her life through folk rather than country. The introspective songwriting of Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Leonard Cohen offered her a space where emotion could exist without explanation. When her grandfather gave her her first guitar, it became more than a pastime. It became an opening. Music became the one place where she could articulate feelings that everyday life did not permit her to express. That early training in silence shaped the stillness listeners would later recognize in her voice. Discipline taught her how to endure, but it did not yet give her the language to define herself. That language began to form only when she left school and stepped into adulthood, initially believing she was headed in an entirely different direction. After graduating high school with exceptional results, Emmylou enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her focus was not singing, but acting. Drama promised a structured way to inhabit emotion through clearly defined roles. She performed in plays, including Shakespeare's The Tempest, learning precision, control, timing, and vocal discipline. Yet a contradiction slowly emerged. Acting demanded deliberate emotional effort. Music, by contrast, flowed naturally. What she played casually to support herself felt more authentic than what she studied formally. By day, she attended classes and rehearsals. By night, she played small gigs simply to pay expenses. The divide became impossible to ignore. In 1967, Emmylou left college without ceremony or security. She moved first to Virginia Beach, then to New York, immersing herself in the folk scene of the late 1960s. Greenwich Village opened before her as a world of intimate rooms, low stages, and audiences seated close enough to breathe the same air. By day, she worked as a waitress. By night, she sang for strangers searching for meaning. Her debut album, Gliding Bird, was released in 1969. Poorly promoted and released into a shifting industry, it failed to gain traction. Commercially, it disappeared. Personally, it nearly ended her musical path before it truly began. That failure coincided with mounting pressures in her private life. In the late 1960s, she met fellow musician Tom Slocum. Two young artists with little stability found comfort in each other. Marriage followed quickly. When Emmylou became pregnant and gave birth to her first daughter, Hallie, her life split sharply in two. Music demanded travel, unpredictability, and late nights. Motherhood demanded presence and routine. The conflict proved unsustainable. Their marriage ended in 1971, not through betrayal but exhaustion. The most painful decision followed, sending Hallie to live with her grandparents in Maryland so she could have stability while Emmylou returned to an uncertain performing life. Back in the Washington, D.C. area, Emmylou sang at venues like the Cellar Door and Clyde's. Nights were filled with music. Days were marked by absence. It was during this time that Bill and Taffy Danoff recognized her voice and helped her survive rather than succeed, securing regular work without promises of fame. Those quiet years built resilience. They placed her in the right room at the right moment. One evening, Chris Hillman heard her sing and mentioned her name to Gram Parsons. When Emmylou entered Parsons' world, everything shifted. Country rock absorbed her folk roots rather than replacing them. Their harmonies felt inevitable, unforced. GP, 1973, and Grievous Angel captured sorrow without dramatization and intimacy without explanation. Parsons' death in September 1973 shattered that foundation. For Emmylou, it was not just the loss of a collaborator but of the first person who convinced her she belonged exactly where she stood. Leaving music crossed her mind, not from fear, but from uncertainty. She stayed. In 1975, Pieces of the Sky emerged as an act of endurance. Songs like Boulder to Birmingham carried grief without spectacle. The album marked her breakthrough. Elite Hotel followed, reaching #1 on the country charts. Success arrived with momentum and pressure. Through albums like Luxury Liner, 1977, and Quarter Moon in a 10-Cent Town, 1978, she balanced discipline and freedom, tradition and innovation. Her voice remained restrained, never theatrical, carrying sorrow rather than performing it. Marriage to producer Brian Ahern in 1977 seemed to offer balance. Their daughter Megan was born in 1979. Yet touring, recording, and creative demands eroded family life. The marriage ended in 1984. Sally Rose followed, a semi-autobiographical album confronting her past directly. Commercially unsuccessful, it marked a turning point inward. Trio with Dolly Parton and Linda Ronstadt, released in 1987, defied industry expectations. It succeeded because of restraint, equality, and emotional clarity. Trio 2 followed in 1999, confirming the strength of that bond. Her third marriage, to Paul Kennelly, ended in 1993. After that, Emmylou did not remarry. She chose a life structured around music, friendship, animals, and selective presence. Becoming a grandmother in 2009 and 2012 brought connection without pressure. Albums like Wrecking Ball, 1995, Red Dirt Girl, 2000, Hard Bargain, 2011, and Old Yellow Moon, 2013, reflected reinvention without erasure. Each phase carried honesty rather than strategy. Emmylou Harris's legacy is not measured by awards or sales alone. It lies in her refusal to simplify herself. She expanded country music quietly, placing emotion before market logic and story before image. She proved endurance could outlast spectacle. Her life stands as evidence that solitude is not failure, but sometimes the price of remaining intact. When her voice rises now, slower and deeper, listeners hear not just a singer, but a life lived fully through contradiction, loss, and clarity, standing not at the center of the spotlight, but in a place where music still holds its dignity. Music,